going to jump straight in. So yeah, fingers crossed clicker works. There we go, so yeah, just a little about me. So my title at the college is Senior Web Developer and Digital Officer. Bit of a mouthful. But the Digital Officer was a really cheeky catch-all joke that our head of at the time implemented. So basically anything technical becomes my problem as well. So not only web and digital, just everything really. But yeah, that's me, LinkedIn, GitHub. Yeah, that's all about me really. That's all you need to know. Cool, so I wanted to start the talk with sort of a kind of like opening sort of question, really. And that's probably what we call the hosting dilemma. So obviously, we have to host our web app somewhere on the world to get to them. And this is some of the sort of terminology that you might have come across. You know, these questions that might come out about what we might need, what we don't need, which is better, which is not. And these are the typical sort of questions we might ask ourselves. And obviously there's no wrong answer, technically. It's based on obviously what works for the environment and what app, but ultimately these are typically questions. And obviously it's really simple, you know, after you understand all of that terminology, you go, yeah, I know what to do, no problem. But yeah, so terminology is kind of like part one of the problem. And then part two, we get to the lovely logo screen where we get loads of different providers. Now, if your provider's not on the screen, don't worry, it doesn't mean I don't like it. It's just that it's one of the examples of sort of just various ways you can do it. We have a mixture of sort of cloud providers, you know, some more specialist providers there, so we've got Serve or Rabbit. Obviously, if you like sort of offloading some of that, you might use Forge as well to do some of the legwork. And then you've got your typical big cloud players like AWS, Google Cloud, Azure. And then you go down to sort of your typical VPS hosting, like sort of DigitalOcean, Linode, I think it's now Akamai, I believe, and then Volta as well, and other options. So they're the kind of the problem. Now, we all love a controversial opinion, right? I don't like DevOps. There you go, a developer that doesn't like DevOps. Who knew it? If you do like DevOps though, that's cool. Don't worry, still like you. But yeah, that's my reaction to DevOps. So yeah, accurate representation. But the reason why is because we kind of go down what we call the platform as a service route. And the main reason is mainly because, you know, we spend sort of, you know, less time sort of managing infrastructure and tweaking stuff and maintaining things, and more time to break production. Sorry, to point postcode. Sorry. We don't break production, right? We never do it. It's never happened. No, there you go. Never happened. And yeah, sometimes if production does break, it's just bonus features. So, you know, it's great value for money, really. Yeah, so we tend to avoid sort of doing some of that management stuff because ultimately we want to spend more time basically actually sort of doing the doing, really. That's not to say that platforms and services are great for everybody. The inherent disadvantage of platform services is it costs, because at the end of the day you're just paying somebody else to do it for you. But that's our investment in sort of seeing more value for money in that versus other things. So a little bit about sort of our sort of Craft CMS sort of journey up until sort of recently. We've basically been running Craft since about 2015, starting at Craft 2. We've been hosted on Fort Rabbit, so you may know the name. It's quite a well-known sort of provider in the space. Fort Rabbit is mainly designed around AWS infrastructure, Amazon Web Services. And in those 9 years, we've run Craft 2, 3, and 5 projects. We skipped 4 because we can't count. No, just kidding. We just happened to align to Craft 5 sort of reasonable sort of time to use it right when it obviously was released, and we just didn't do 4 because we stayed on 3 for probably a little bit too long. But these things happen, and ultimately, yeah, so we've got a fair bit of experience with running sort of apps on the platform. But then, in August 2024, something happened. A new contender appears, and that is that Craft Cloud was officially released to the world on the 6th of August 2024. Obviously the launch and everything. It had been sort of in beta, I think, for a few months prior where it had some sort of smaller testing, but yeah, it appeared on the scene, and obviously like any sort of new hosting thing, we're like, oh, that's exciting. It's also a major landmark because it's actually taken about sort of 13 years or so, I think, about that. But there is now a first-party hosting option for Craft CMS, which is kind of crazy when you think about it, that it's been this long since it's happened. But here we are, and it's here, and it's out there. And pleased to say that since the 25th of November 2024, Nottingham College's website has been hosted on Craft Cloud. The evidence is there if you want to check. There's also a joke about living on the edge somewhere, but on that one. But yeah, go and check it out, www.nottinghamcollege.uk. Cool. So, key features of Craft Cloud. So I wanted to open up with kind of a bit of a big sort of bit about this. Now, Abstract's own Lucy did a great talk about sustainability. And one of the things that we're also committed to is obviously sustainability, but also it goes further. So obviously you can make a website sustainable, but then it also goes down to how it's being hosted, how it's being run, some of the technical side behind it. And Craft Cloud, I'm pleased to say, is a very, very sustainable platform to host a website on. That's mainly down to its serverless infrastructure. The inherent benefit of serverless infrastructure is basically you're just using requests on demand. So let's say, for example, if you're hosting your Craft website on a typical what we call VPS or virtual private server, it sits on that server, it's running 24/7, and then people go to it. Obviously, in between that, when it's idle, it's just sitting there using energy and doing nothing. With serverless, you're only using the energy for the requests that happen. So the requests that don't happen, no energy being used. So that's kind of a sustainable effort to kind of open up with. There's more benefits to serverless as well. It's performance, and we'll get into that. But that's kind of a key one for us is part of that. And there's other parts as well that touch on sustainability, which we'll go through now. But the first one is kind of content delivery. So Craft Cloud ships with its own native CDN built into it. So typically for some Craft projects, we might be using stuff like AWS or Google Storage or DigitalOcean perhaps, whatever the storage sort of option is. Craft Cloud ships with its own, so all of your assets, front-end build stuff and everything else is all sort of served from that CDN for you. So literally it's done pretty much for you. Another benefit for sustainability and performance is static caching. So I think we all probably, most of us in the room know what caching is, but static caching goes a bit further by basically serving entire requests cached. So let's take our homepage for example. Typically it's not changing too much other than maybe some of the panels on there. When that is happening, obviously it's refreshed, but when it's not, the whole page is cached, so it's just served back to you straight away. And that's really fast. It's served through Cloudflare, and it's built also with Craft's cache and validation in mind, which is, again, really beneficial because it's kind of really quality built into it, so you don't get the problem of obviously stale caching and things like that. And then finally, on-demand sort of image transforms. Typically we might be using services like ImageX or ImageX or the ImageX plugin to do it. Craft ships with its own sort of image transform service. So you literally have it offloaded from your web app so it never gets bogged down with chunky image transforms, because if we're being honest, the default method in Craft isn't ideal. Running it on the app isn't great. Cool, so that's the cool stuff. This is the I don't want to do DevOps ever stuff, because I'm not doing DevOps. Code deployments, so we've got to get our code up in the cloud somehow. Craft ships with basically a pretty much zero configuration code deployment setup. I say zero, there's about 5 lines in the YAML file, but well, 6 for us because we changed the web route, but 5 if you're doing it probably on a minimal sort of setup. Code deployments are handled for you, so you don't have to worry about configuring pipelines, CI or anything like that, it's all done for you. Another thing is the queue, so typically we need to run long-running tasks and the queue is vital for that. You get a queue work automatically with Craft Cloud, it's configured for you, you don't have to touch it, so you don't have to modify at config, anything like that. And automatic scaling, so going back to a bit of the serverless side of things, but typically in some of the sort of hosting scenarios you might need to scale what we call horizontally or vertically depending on resources. With serverless, it's literally just, it's not infinite because it's a bit of a buzzword to use, oh it's infinitely scalable, but it is essentially just handling demand as it happens. So literally if you get an influx of traffic, handled, scales down, scales up, just basically goes with the flow. So really useful. And yeah, pretty much can handle pretty much most demanding tasks. So really good. So this is the stuff that makes me sleep better at night, because being the senior web developer, unfortunately I have a fair bit of responsibility. Liam's seen me have many moments in the world, but with Craft Cloud you get Cloudflare's enterprise level sort of firewalling. I think everyone's kind of aware that Cloudflare is probably one of the biggest sort of names in this business for protecting web apps from bad stuff. So you're getting that enterprise level DDoS protection and everything else, which is great. Automatic TLS, so pretty much a common standard now. Obviously Let's Encrypt is pretty much everywhere to be available, but ultimately that's just built into Cloudflare anyway, because you You can just equally get a certificate through Cloudflare, but it's all built in for you. And the support with Craft Cloud, of course, is coming from the Craft CMS developers. So you're never going to get anyone better to support you on sort of problems because it's literally coming from the Craft team. So yeah, absolutely, it's probably the best support you're ever going to get. Cool, and then just some other notable mentions. You get generous bandwidth allowances, so generally you probably don't need to worry about hitting these because with CDN and the static caching layer, if you set it up right, you'll be surprised how little your app is actually being used because it's all coming from the cache and the CDN, and obviously the CDN gets cached as well. So you'll be surprised like the in-app traffic or the bandwidth traffic within your app is surprisingly low. Asset storage, if you've got sort of big websites, can go up to about 250 gig currently. I'm sure it can probably go higher, but that's kind of the advertised sort of max at the moment. If you're worried about database space, don't. You've got unlimited database storage between MySQL and Postgres, so don't worry. If you're multi-site sort of setup or you're going to be routing sort of multiple domains, you can route as many as you like. The only stipulation is each top level domain is costed, so I think it's about $20 per domain, but you can get as many subdomains for free. So if you only ever have one domain, that's fine. If you have multiple domains, it's every top domain that costs, but then all subdomains underneath are free, so it's fine. And one of the kind of maybe the bigger selling points is the Craft CMS license is included with Craft Cloud. So you don't get to bring your own license. You literally just get a license with the Craft Cloud package you go with. There are 3 tiers: Team, Pro, and then Enterprise, which is pretty much blank check because it could be anything. It's kind of custom. So most people will probably go with Team or Pro. Only the Enterprise level is probably going to be for really like SLA type scenarios, but that's kind of the key stuff really. So now I want to kind of go in with some of the deeper, darker secrets of Craft Cloud, which is what I call the limits and quirks. So one of the interesting quirks with Craft Cloud, being serverless, it's also what we call ephemeral, and that's taken me about, how many, 2 years to pronounce properly? Ephemeral. It's a fancy word for temporary. I don't know why we can't just call it temporary, but ephemeral is the word. And basically means that when your web app is deployed on Craft Cloud, it basically only exists until the next deployment, and then your next build entirely overwrites it. So what that means is basically everything in your source control will just overwrite the previous. That does mean that you have to be careful about storing things in your actual web root. It's probably actually recommended that you don't at all because there's very limited things you can do in this environment. But typically you should be kind of like offloading your assets and stuff to the CDN. Obviously you can use asset storage. And there's many other ways to do sort of things like that. So just something to bear in mind. You've got some sort of maximum request times with Craft Cloud. 28 seconds is like web requests. So you've probably got to worry if your web app's taking 28 seconds to respond to a front end request, I must say. But for longer running tasks, that's your maximum on a web request. Of course, if you are going to do some longer running stuff, the queue is obviously the right way to go. So you've just got to bear in mind that that's in play for web requests specifically. This one's really nerdy, but it's Cloudflare restriction, so I just thought I'd drop it in there. If you're a fan of making requests with really large HTTP headers, I don't know, 16,000 bytes is about the limit before Cloudflare may drop the request. It says it may, it might not, it might do, but you just got to avoid having long sort of HTTP header sort of data really. You can probably only really get into this scenario when you are using, say, like really long cookie values as HTTP headers. It's probably not something you're going to hit, so it's pretty rare restriction probably. This one might scare a few people, so we're going to come back to this in a minute when we go through some other bits, but the maximum web response length is limited to 6 meg. Now assets aren't included in this. This is purely sending data to your web app. So again, park this for a second because I'm sure some few people are going, whoa, that's low, and you're right, it is, but we'll cover that in a minute. Queue jobs, so we talked about the queue obviously offloading to longer running tasks. CLI commands and queue jobs must complete within 15 minutes, so basically that's just your maximum time. We were used to this because Fort Rabbit's actually 20 minutes, so we just lost 5 minutes, but there are ways around this which we'll cover in a minute, but just bear that in mind for those kind of scenarios. If you're a fan of tweaking PHP configuration, you technically can with Craft Cloud, but it's completely undocumented. So it's not something that typically you might want to do on Craft Cloud as much because it's kind of managed for you. There are a few config files that you can manipulate, which we have done. One of the ones was to do with the max post bars that you can send in a request. particularly plugins like Formy, when you've got really large integrations with forms, can fall foul of this. So it was useful to be able to change them, but it isn't actually documented anywhere. So yeah, I'm not quite sure why, but it is possible to change certain parameters, but some aren't because of the infrastructure as well. So there are a few restrictions there. And if you're a fan of SSHing into your sort of web app and running things, you can't, sorry. It's serverless, so there is no actual place to actually SSH into. So it's a bit of a, ooh, that's a bit weird, because obviously if you're used to kind of like getting into a console and running stuff, you can't do that. You can run commands still at your app in the same way with the Craft CLI, but you can't just root into something because it doesn't technically exist. It's serverless, so there's nothing to jump into. And this one's kind of a bit of a quirk from Craft Cloud itself. So I think we probably, some of us obviously that do plugin development know what asset bundling is when a plugin needs to load like CSS, JavaScript, all that stuff. The way that asset bundles work on Craft Cloud is because of the ephemeral sort of setup of the environment, it can't be deployed to the web root because they'll just constantly be lost because it's not permanent space. Instead, they get directed to a CDN. So actually all of your asset bundles are getting served from a CDN and not the web root. This is done for you, so you don't have to do anything yourself. So yeah, that's kind of a bit of a quirk with Craft Cloud, because obviously asset bundles usually are just part of the main web app, but no, they come from the CDN in this case from Craft Cloud. So Craft Cloud things to watch out for, which is a bit of a mouthful, but so talking about obviously the ephemeral storage, you can technically write to certain places in ephemeral. Mostly what happens when it's running in this mode is basically most of Craft is read-only for the most part. Obviously the database can still change and you can upload assets and everything like that, but your core sort of config and web root and everything like that is kind of locked down. You can't really do much. But you still have options to write to the temporary storage. So for example, we ingest a lot of data from external sort of sources and APIs. We also have to rewrite some of that structure to work for Craft's data model. We can write to the temporary path and then immediately save that file into, say, like something like S3 or a permanent storage that's obviously able to then be referenced at all times because it's always going to exist. So that's what we generally use sort of that for. Asset bundles, so we talked about obviously this magic where it kind of gets redirected to the CDN. Some plugins, so not all, but some, depending on how the pathing structure has been set up in that plugin, if it's not compatible with Craft Cloud, it's going to have a bad time. So there are a few plugins that have had issues and have been fixed. There is actually talks with the developers at the moment to kind of make this more sort of on the emphasis of Craft Cloud rather than getting plugin developers to change, because technically this is a Craft Cloud thing and not necessarily a Craft plugin thing. So there might be some handling of that later on to make it a little bit nicer, but at the moment there are some plugins that may fall foul of this. So we found a few, Formy was one, there are a few others, but it is fairly simple to fix. The good news is the fix is pretty much sort of, it works for both. So if you're not hosted on Craft Cloud, it will work fine still, and if it's on Craft Cloud, it works properly. So luckily, it's not like a have to do a if Craft Cloud fix, because that would be awful and terrible. But yeah, just something to bear in mind. So the 15-minute max thing can get a bit tricky when you've got really long running queue jobs. The really cool thing is FeedMe, the plugin obviously we typically use to like ingest data, has just released native batch queue jobs. Yes. So natively now what happens when a queue job's about to run out of its max time, it will just then spawn another job and continue on. So that's really useful because up until then you'd have to roll your own, which is a bit naff. So yeah, so hopefully it makes it easier for FeedMe. Obviously if you're doing something custom, you're going to have to probably use batchable queue jobs and handle that yourself. But yeah, that's something to be aware of. So CSRF, cross-site request forgery, obviously hopefully everyone's got that enabled and hasn't disabled it, because if you are, you're crazy. But the cool thing is that, or rather not the cool thing, but the one enemy of cross-site request forgery is caching. I think probably everyone in the room who's a developer has probably hit this at some point where they've unfortunately had this situation where you've cached a CSRF token and then it's broken the house and everything's burnt down. With static caching it's a bit dangerous, but the cool thing is that I think in more recent versions of Craft 4 and 5 you do have a native async CSRF handling, so it dynamically will refresh CSRF tokens to essentially do it via JavaScript rather than caching an actual token in your templates, which is a lot safer because obviously you then avoid having that problem. So yeah, pretty much if you are going to use sort of something like Craft Cloud, you're going to want to use asynchronous CSRF because otherwise it's going to have a bad time. So something to bear in mind. Now I'm going to be honest, the cron functionality of sort of running jobs with like scheduled jobs running on a certain schedule is really quite poor at the moment in Craft Cloud. I'm not going to lie to you. You only get 5 jobs per environment. So obviously an environment can be staging, live, preview, whichever. You only get 5 jobs, and a minimum schedule of 1 hour is only allowed, so you can't go lower than 1 hour, which is pretty rough, in my opinion. There are workarounds around this. Mainly our workaround has been to roll our own sort of cron controller that we can then send HTTP requests to trigger jobs. We then send, that request is sent from some of the external service, so something like, but we use Buddy, for example. There's other services you can do it with, where we've got control of the cron scheduling and everything else. So a bit rough, hopefully something that they'll develop more because it was only released in December, to be fair. It didn't have cron jobs until December of last year, so something I think could definitely be developed more, but yeah, something to bear in mind. So we're revisiting that lovely 6 meg limit on requests. So this can mainly impact sort of probably forms. So if we're uploading data, say like a file upload or things, or posting a lot of data to a website, that's where this 6 meg limit is going to come in. Now this 6 meg limit, it's just important to note that this is from Amazon's infrastructure side, not Craft Cloud, because obviously it's leveraging AWS Lambda, the serverless component. That's a hard limit from AWS, so it's not Craft Cloud enforcing it. They just have to abide by it. But the main issue around sort of forms is obviously mostly file uploads, but what you can do is essentially like how Craft itself handles asset uploading, that bypasses the web layer, basically. It goes through the S3 layer instead. What you can do with forms is basically use the asset layer to essentially send the raw data up. Then at the end, you link in the actual asset to the actual request. Obviously, it's just a resource at that point rather than the full data, so you kind of get around that problem. There are a few other instances where that 6 meg limit may come into play. Obviously, if you've got really large like CMS entry with like loads of fields on it, you could in theory get to a 6 meg limit perhaps. We haven't hit it yet on ours, but it's something that we are mindful of because it could happen. And it's obviously something to bear in mind if you are going to deal with something like that. But yeah, and then this one's kind of like it's a bit annoying. I accept it for what it is, but it's something that probably could do better. So the code deployment side, we've talked about obviously pretty much the zero CI config scenario. The problem is, partly due to how Craft Cloud is, every code build essentially requires your entire app to be rebuilt from essentially from scratch. So the idea is that basically when you do a code build, you have an image created of your sort of project source that's deployed up to the serverless infrastructure, and then that's where your app is running. When you do a code deployment, it basically just completely rebuilds that image again and replaces it entirely, and then that's how it kind of serves it. The issue with that is the build and runtime is really slow, and we're talking an average between 8 minutes to about 20 to 30, so it's not great on that yet. The other part that doesn't help is asset bundling. They have to, obviously we have to build all those assets, and then they have to be redirected to the CDN. That obviously takes time as well, depending on how many plugins you've got installed. That can really slow the build process down, and that's where part of the time is going at the moment. The asset building side is the asset bundling side rather is the part that's kind of slowing it down. They are working on doing better sort of stuff here, like obviously caching the composer build is an easy sort of like win there. Not having to rebuild the app when you're changing environment variables and stuff like that. There's things that can be done. It's just something at the moment that's a little bit rough, if I'm honest. But we accept it for what it is, because ultimately the code build's fine, it just takes much longer. The only downside to where this can be a problem is, say for example, if you've got an emergency, like I need to get this code up like ASAP because I've just broke something hard and it's going to take like 20 minutes to get up there. It's not good, but hey, this is what we're dealing with, and it is still new. So it's kind of like these things are, let's say, probably early adopter / new scenarios. And then this one's a really fun one. So depending on if you've got multiple environments, we obviously have our source control in GitHub. We can trigger a lovely race condition where basically if you have multiple concurrent builds happening at the same time, you can actually cause the OAuth token to be invalid, which then drops the entire repository connection, and then you lose the build entirely, which is great. They are working on a fix for this. The easiest fix at the moment is not doing concurrent builds and just doing it one by one, so you never have the issue of basically for the race condition that happens where you basically hit the OAuth token at the same time, one request is valid, the other one isn't, comes invalidated, game's over. But yeah, bit of a fun one, but hey, we have 3 environments, so that's why we can trigger it quite badly. But yeah, that's kind of all of the sort of the watch out things I can say for really. But so the key points to recap. So kind of just wanted to finish off with sort of the key things. So Craft Cloud sort of provides sort of several native features that you kind of maybe already might be using with other services. So kind of the 3 that I can think of are sort of if you're using like say Amazon S3, Craft Cloud ships with its own sort of bucket configured for you. It's also using S3, but it's using Craft Cloud's storage option instead. The benefit of using Craft Cloud storage option is the native CDN that's built in with it. If you use it, if you can bring your own bucket, but obviously then you have to configure the CDN side yourself and mess around. So obviously going with the theme of not doing DevOps, trying to avoid that. Obviously the static caching built in is really cool. There's other stuff on the market like Blitz cache. Obviously that's an option for other people that might not be using this currently, but you might be able to replace those entirely. And there's also other services like obviously if you're doing image transforms through the cloud, like using the ImagerX plugin, for example, with the native image transforming on Craft Cloud, you don't have to worry about that at all because it does it for you, which is great. Craft Cloud is very scalable, so it's a very scalable, performant and sort of sustainable, obviously thanks to that infrastructure really. For all its quirks and sort of, let's say, limitations perhaps to a point, the performance is rapid. Yeah, it's kind of like, yeah, it's the fastest we've ever had a website running on. Our homepage can load within a second because literally it's been served from a cache basically most of the time. So we're also hitting Cloudflare's infrastructure half the time and not even our own app. So, you know, yay for not using bandwidth, sustainability. Craft Cloud is a relatively new platform. Obviously it was only launched in August. It's obviously now, what is it now? It's March, isn't it? Yeah, thank you, yeah, it's March. The sort of the setup at the moment, obviously it's been less than a year. Obviously they're taking feedback, they're looking at improving things. So at the moment there are probably some, what I would say, rough spots, but I think it's going to get better. I would kind of relate this back to akin to kind of like how maybe Craft CMS was at the beginning. Obviously maybe a bit rough in the start, documentation was less, stuff like that, but over time it's built community, things around it, and hopefully I think that's going to be the same with Craft Cloud. Slow burner, but we'll get there. Going on to sort of like documentation, so for people that are coming into Craft Cloud new, I would say that some of these sort of themes and topics here are probably not as documented as they could be. I think fortunately for us, we were used to sort of the similar infrastructure that's running here, so the transition perhaps hasn't been as painful. But for someone that's maybe jumping in quite fresh, I would say some of the documentation probably could be better. But again, that will improve over time, I believe. Obviously the real benefit here is the support is amazing. Like honestly, I've had many conversations directly with Brad Bell, one of the sort of main Craft CMS developers. So you are in good hands. And when it's not Brad Bell, it's one of the highly qualified team to kind of deal with your problem. And obviously the feedback you're getting and the help you're getting is yeah, second to none really. There's nothing else really probably better. And we're not paying for any like sort of support package with them. We're just getting the standard support that the pro license kind of grants you. So again, yeah, really sort of good stuff. And yeah, kind of like what was the community side of it. So like Craft CMS, obviously it's a Craft pixel and tonic product. Craft Cloud has a public roadmap like the CMS itself, and obviously you can track the development progress, submit feature requests, ideas, community feedback. It's all there. You'll probably find my name on the feedback sort of topics on GitHub because I think I've posted about like 7 or 8 because I won't leave them alone. But in terms of that, there will be a growing community and there's definitely interest in obviously like extending and developing and improving things where there's sort of gaps that we've kind of covered. So yeah, kind of just finishing off, there's kind of like 2 major call outs I kind of wanted to give you. So if anyone wants the slide deck, I can obviously send it to you. There's some resources on there that kind of goes through some of the stuff that I've discussed here today, but in a bit more of a technical detail. If anyone is interested in the technical, I highly recommend the case study. That's from a company called Breath. They are part of the Craft sort of cloud chain of how it's all running. And they did a case study on the team about sort of how they use their infrastructure to run essentially the serverless side of the sort of delivering an app. If you're a plugin developer, you can get a free sandbox for Craft Cloud. They are offering free sandboxes so you can test your plugins. You can get the Craft Cloud compatible checkmark. So there are plugins in the store that do have it. If you can obviously test your plugin on the sandbox and it can verify as working okay, and it goes through the same sort of verification as all other plugins do, you can get that lovely check mark, which makes me happy if I'm looking for a plugin and goes, oh, they've tested on GraphCloud, I like that. So yeah, you can contact the Craft CMS team to get access to that because it is for free, and you just get a limited sandbox environment. And obviously, if you're really interested in running an app on GraphCloud just as a test, you get a 7-day free trial, which is really nice. It's pretty much unlimited, apart from you can't route your own domain to it, but you do get a free sort of test domain while it's there, so that's fine. If you ask really nicely, they'll extend it at no charge as well. So we actually got 14 days free when we were testing our new website on it, and we basically got 14 days of compute time for free. So hey, we like that. So if you ask really nicely though, and if Brad maybe replies, you might be alright. So we'll see. But yeah, it's kind of the main sort of closing messages really. If there are any questions, please ask away. Maybe not about DevOps, but other than that, thank you very much for listening. Hope it's been useful. And yeah, over to you really. So yeah, thank you very much. Hello.
What would be the sort of benefit of that? Something like Lightsail or something?
A lot of the Craft Cloud is essentially, it's removing a lot of the DevOps management side of things. Really. They've kind of built it from the perspective of not having to touch a lot of configuration. So ultimately, a lot of it's built in. So like the whole performance side, the CDN, static caching, it's kind of just natively built into it. So you're not even having to worry about installing a plugin. Well, technically you have to. There is a Craft Cloud module. It's not a plugin technically. It's like an extension module that kind of just does some sort of work to make it compatible with obviously the Craft Cloud environment. You install it in your project like anything else. When you're running locally, it doesn't do anything really. It just sits idle. When it's running on a Craft Cloud environment, that module then kicks in to let all of the Craft Cloud stuff like static caching and all of that stuff work. So it's yeah, it's really kind of the main way I would say is basically if you're not interested in like configuring all of that, Craft Cloud's a good option because it literally is just shipping all that for you. That's kind of how I look at it. So yeah, that's kind of how I describe that one.
Cool.
Yeah. Hello.
So two-part question.
Sure.
Did you consider Serve when you were considering whether to go with Craft Cloud? And
Yes.
The second follow-up question is on the support.
Yes.
What's the response time like for that? Because they're all US based, aren't they?
Yes. Yeah.
UK.
Absolutely.
That would be my biggest concern.
Absolutely. Yeah. It's a great question. It's a great question. So on the first part for Serve, yes. Typically, technically on that sort of like logos slide. Technically, Craft Cloud, Fort Rabbit, and Served are very similar in terms of their setup and infrastructure scenario. They're all a little bit different in a way, but yeah, they're all kind of the same sort of like model. Served D we ultimately didn't go with, not because we didn't like it. We just have a bit of ding ding. We just have a sort of a bit of a thing about installing like provider plugins into sort of projects. So like with Serve, it comes with its own like asset handling. So does Fort Rabbit, and we actively avoided using it with Fort Rabbit because we didn't want to have to be like locked into a provider. Now, obviously, technically, we're doing that with Craft Cloud, but we're not really installing plugins. We've got a module that ships with the entire project, so it's just bootstrapped to it all the time. So it's not really a plugin that you have to install. Technically, we still have the gotchas of obviously if we ever move away from Craft Cloud, we've got all of that static caching stuff and everything else that we'd have to do somewhere else. Yeah. But the configuration for that is done outside of our app. It's not actually in our app, so it kind of removes that problem. To come back to your other point about support, you're absolutely right, the time zone. Yeah, there is some gaps, particularly with something like the US side, but they do have an EU-based support as well. So there is EU support, yeah. So it's covered in US, EU, and other territories as well. So it's important to actually mention the Craft Cloud itself. There are a few territories where you can deploy your app as well. So it's not exclusively in US. There are EU data centers as well. I think the EU one is in Germany, Frankfurt, which, funny enough, is also where Fort Rabbit was. But yeah, so that's kind of that one. That makes sense.
Yeah.
Cool.
Carry on.
Good. Keep going.
So with Craft going to, Craft 6 going to
Laravel, yeah.
Laravel Cloud just launching
Yeah.
recently.
Interesting.
Yeah. What are your thoughts on that? Because could that potentially make Craft Cloud a little redundant?
I feel
Just the choice of that?
no. I think to be fair with Craft Cloud, the original. I think Craft Cloud was meant to appear a lot sooner than it has.
Yeah.
What's happened with it was originally developed under a scenario where it was kind of like really sort of niche. Like I think it was like designed for like headless. Yeah, which like okay, people use headless, but like that's not the majority of Craft CMS apps. So it wasn't really very sort of accessible. So they've ultimately kind of gone with well, we're going back to the drawing board. I think essentially it's taken probably another 3 or 4 years to then actually come out properly. And obviously the launch on 6th of August 2024 is kind of the rewrite of that product. Now Laravel obviously with Craft 6. I feel that the Craft team want to have a first-party hosting option. Obviously, it's taken some time, but I do feel that that's what they're interested in doing. There's a lot of investment in DevOps / sort of hosting scenarios. Like when they've been recruiting, there's definitely been a few roles that I've seen that's like exclusively for essentially Craft Cloud. So I think they're kind of like investing in that. So I feel that Craft Cloud's not going to go anywhere. They're not going to just pull it and go, oh, by the way, just move to Laravel, that's fine. I think they are interested in running their own environment, mainly because partly due to the sustainability side as well. That's really important. I think that they want to have a really, really tailored, Craft CMS option that they've kind of built from the ground up that's literally about as tied to Craft as it could ever be. And that's not to say that the likes of Served and Fort Rabbit and any other option, in fact, aren't doing a good job. It's just that there are benefits to obviously having a natively supported Craft environment with the performance gains as well as the support and everything like that. So I think it will definitely be an option like anything else, but I guess the cool thing with Craft Cloud is Craft CMS itself is it can run virtually anywhere. It's just a PHP app. Obviously you can run it well or you can run it terribly, but the point being that it can run virtually in many ways and there's options. And I think the more options out there is great in my opinion. It can be a bit of a minefield as we've seen, like terminology, it's really a bit of a minefield if you're not in that space or you're coming at it new. But I think Craft Cloud's here to stay basically for those reasons.
Must have been pretty scary moving on to this as a brand new website. It's a big website that you're running.
One day I'll write a book of like how edgy and ridiculous it probably was. But no, I mean, in a way, to be fair, like the similarities with obviously previous Bright Fort Rabbit was probably enough confidence enough to do it. If you were coming at it completely blind, it's probably not something we would do. But there were benefits to moving away from Fort Rabbit as well, though. So in terms of cost and price, Fort Rabbit is billed in euros, which our finance team absolutely loved for 10 years. They were loving it. Good news, it's now in dollars. So still in non-UK currency, but you get converts obviously. But the point being that obviously it wasn't necessarily too dissimilar. There was a fair bit of learning though to obviously build a website into sort of how to hook into all the CDN and the static caching side to make it work as well as it can. That took a bit of time, obviously, sort of during the probably in fairness in the launch phase as well. When we launched, probably the website wasn't running in the most performant way possible. But obviously over time, we got sort of a handle on it and got it working. Obviously, it was running okay, but images were probably not running as fast as they could be. Static caching wasn't working in places and stuff, things like that. So yeah, it wasn't.
Do you feel it's running as well as it can now?
Yes.
Do you think is there more you'll be able to?
Yeah, no.
Is there still things that you've not uncovered yet that will make it?
I think we're about there. So I think the main areas where we were kind of caught out on was some of the static caching side. So when I talked about obviously the CSRF side of things, if for whatever reason you're not handling that properly, that turns off the static caching entirely because of basically you could risk caching a CSRF token.
And then your performance tank.
And then the performance tank. So basically you're then just reloading that page constantly. Once we got the async stuff sorted and working properly, that basically went away. So, I mean, I can probably do a quick, this will be a bit risky, but here we go, I'm going to go rogue. If I load our website now, chances are when I load the home page, you can ignore our internal portal that no one's actually other than stuff, but don't worry. You see how that loaded quite quickly. If we go into the the network stuff here, just bear with me. And I reload that request again. And I grab the original HTTP request that was delivered, which I can't now find. Where's the video? Not college day, so okay, there. see where it says Cloudflare Clash status hit. That's been served from obviously Cloudflare's edge, so that's not actually hit the web app at all because it's been cached completely. So obviously that kind of fast loading is literally down to the static caching because this entire page was cached entirely, which obviously, you know, we can cache a header, we can cache the banner, we can cache, you know, all of the panels on this page here, but realistically nothing's going to beat the static caching, and on top of that, the image CDN side as well, they're all cached as well because they haven't changed, and the image transforms have obviously been run and transformed and then cached as well, so really performant, and obviously that kind of speed was just something that, you know, we haven't seen on anything that we've run before.
I was going to say, do you have comparisons from what you had?
From four, yeah. So from
before and after, so to speak.
I don't have exact. Yeah, no, I don't have exact numbers for you. But what I can probably say that on the Fort Rabbit side, there wasn't static caching because I mean there aren't any plugins to do it. It's going to make a massive difference, and also we were doing this caching as much as we could in places like, you know, the header, the footer, the banner, and everything else like here. But yeah, the speed is literally like seconds difference in some cases. It's crazy, and that's obviously why it's like wow. It was a real big eye opener for us. But obviously Cloudflare harnessing that kind of caching layer that it already has, and then building it with Craft CMS's invalidation, caching validation methods in mind. Because obviously when we change the homepage now, that will just automatically refresh the cache for us. We don't have to clear ourselves. It will just do it for you. And then what will happen, obviously, if I jump over here, we'll see obviously all of these properties change. So at the moment that'll be a hit. Obviously if we clear the cache, that'll then go to a miss, and then that will reload the cache for the next request. So someone's going to be lucky enough to get the homepage full on not cached. Whoever that is, sorry. But then everyone else is going to benefit from the cached version again. So yeah, that's kind of, that was one of the major reasons why we saw the capability of it, and obviously the scalability of it as well. Like the request size obviously is much more reduced by caching everything, and and all the images not being served constantly from the same place. It's just all cached. So yeah. Hello.
One other question on the pricing. You didn't mention about
I
pricing.
didn't. Yes, I'm not.
For me, like
I'm not a salesperson, you see, but I don't represent CraftCloud. They should probably pay me, but well, depending on what I've sold it to. But funny enough, CraftCloud SEO, not that great. Usually, the best way is Craft CMS. Which, to be fair, it's funny the CEO joke actually, because in the beginning with Craft itself, actually, it was quite funny with the SEO scenario, because you just put in, oh, Craft, you should know what I mean. It's like, oh no, here's some awesome Craft things. No. So pricing wise, there's basically 3 tiers. So that's not the right one, that's the actual CMS pricing. There we go. So team is your $120 a month. What you get with that is a team license, Craft TMS license. You get pretty much all of what I've just talked about there, and you get 2 environments. So that's kind of that. The next one is Pro, which is what our college website is running on. That basically just pretty much grants you a Craft Pro license and an additional environment, so you get 3 instead. And then Enterprise, the blank check of could be anything, is on the right, which when it says contact us, that usually means lots of money. But obviously with the Enterprise, this is going to be reserved for your really big scenarios. You need a custom license agreement. You need pretty much 99.9% uptime. You need support like literally like an hour, 2 hours, whatever. The one other benefit over the Enterprise is you do get essentially single sign-on. So obviously it would be nice actually if single sign-on was in Pro, but unfortunately it's not. But obviously if you're dealing with a large organisation with like hundreds of users, single sign-on obviously is going to be really beneficial. But we're fortunate enough that while we're obviously a big college in terms of like sort of turnover and staff, we've got about 1,000 sort of 500 staff or so, and our turnover is about 80 million a year. The actual team that runs our website, 2 of us are in the room right now, and there's 2 other people, and that's it. So our website is very much managed in-house by our own marketing team, so we don't need like millions of people hitting it all the time in terms of like CMS changing and stuff. But that's kind of the typical pricing. There are I talked about bandwidth limits and stuff. They're down here. So there's a lot of kind of like sort of bits and pieces in here to have a look at. But I think bandwidth's covered somewhere. But it's fairly generous. In fact, it's actually 10 times what we had in Fort Raggett, and we never went near it. So I think there we go. Bandwidth's there. Bear in mind, bandwidth is kind of like traffic from your web app and asset stuff, but obviously with caching and obviously serving assets cached, it won't count because caching doesn't count to your bandwidth usage. And obviously the edge bandwidth, so obviously from like the likes of Cloudflare and stuff, and the Craft Cloud CDN it's not charged at all or anything. So, but yeah, and then everything else is mostly pretty much the domain one I kind of covered. You get you get one domain included of your choosing, so obviously ours is just, we actually have a multi-site, so we've got nottinghamcollege.ac.uk, and then we also have a commercial restaurant, which is a separate domain, so obviously it doesn't make sense to go on ac.k domain. So we have 2 domains, and then we've just got various sorts of subdomains and stuff like that. But it's $20 per domain, which isn't very clear actually on it, but that's the cost. Yeah. Good stuff. Thank you very much. Appreciate obviously listening. And yeah, like I say, if anyone wants to come and see me after or anything like that, do let me know. I can happily show you sort of how Craft Cloud is and works and stuff like that. So yeah, feel free.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.